all I can say is, wow, what an amazing turnout. This is really incredible. It's a new idea for us to bring together the many families and individuals who have donated family documents to the library over the course of the past year, or actually in this case we decided to widen it to people who had given recently, because we really felt there could be great value in bringing people together who are currently helping us build up our archives, and what an amazing result. I'm just delighted to see the room so full, and I can definitely tell as well multiple generations represented here, which is magnificent, because in a sense the people who have donated papers to the library, they're like an extended family to us, and it really is the lifeblood of this institution to have people like yourselves who continue to build our legacy, the richness of our collections. And my name's Toby Simpson. I'm the director of the Wiener Holocaust Library. It's just such a privilege to work here, and I did want to just sort of start by saying what an extraordinary institution this is. Given that everybody gathered here today has entrusted us with such precious materials, I have a feeling most of you know the basics of what the Wiener Library is. And we have a full programme. We're going to be hearing from Romeo Vecht, who's donated some family papers, a fascinating story. Also hearing from our senior archivist, Howard, who I think most of you also will know. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I did want to just say how much we appreciate you being here. I'm going to also be sort of circulating around the room when we have coffee and cake. I'd really love to take this opportunity to get to know you a bit, because it's rarely been a one-off thing, and I'm sure it isn't seen as a sort of a one-off event passing over your precious documents. This really is about building a relationship, and not just one generation but across multiple generations. So I really would love to take the opportunity to get to know you. So afterwards I'm going to try and get round and speak to everyone if I possibly can. So this institution, the world's oldest Holocaust archive, an incredibly varied, trusted resource for Holocaust remembrance, education, research. And our founder, Alfred Wiener, had a vision really, but I think even he would have been astonished to see the library thriving as it is in London 90 years after he founded the institution, in completely different circumstances, having fled from Nazi Germany and trying to raise the alarm about the mortal threat posed to Jews in Germany at that time, and then later across Europe. So this institution is extraordinary, but I think even more than what we have here, what we do here, really it's the people that make this place. And even in the case of Alfred Wiener, it's so meaningful to us that his grandchildren are involved with our work, and even his great-grandchildren. So some of you may have heard of Daniel Finkelstein, who writes for the Times. He's Alfred Wiener's grandson, for anyone who isn't aware. Also, anyone who hasn't had the chance to really dig into the story of the Wiener Library and its amazing history, how it came to be here. Daniel Finkelstein's written a fantastic book about his parents called Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, which came out just a year or so ago. And I would highly recommend it to anyone who wants to really get that insight into just what a miracle it is, really, or even, as Alfred Wiener said, an annually recurring miracle, that the Wiener Library is still here, still thriving, documenting the Holocaust and educating present and future generations. So, I wanted to just quote from Daniel Finkelstein because on the occasion of the library's 90th anniversary, I think he really summed up the importance of you all and what you do by supporting us and by contributing to our collections. And he said, "The Wiener Holocaust Library is a wonderful institution. It's efficient, forward-looking, admired, and able to do great things with the resources it holds. But it's only able to do these things because in each generation there are people who understood its importance. In each generation there were people who matched its founders' willingness to do their duty, whatever it took, to make sure the truth was told. And now that generation is us." So we all, I think, by being connected with the library, feel like we're part of something bigger. And that's definitely how it feels to come and work here every day. I hope that's how it's felt to entrust your family materials to us, to become part of a bigger story. So thank you so much on behalf of all of us. I'm looking forward to getting to know you better. Before I hand over, as I said, I don't want to take too long, but I want to give a couple of examples of the kinds of people that I think Alfred Wiener sort of had in his vision of how the library could develop, people who cared like he did so much about the truth and about telling the stories that the library held. I'm going to give 3 examples going across generations. So given that we're about to mark the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, I really wanted to share with you a bit about the life of Trude Levy, who actually worked at the library. You can see her here carrying stacks of books, working at the library I think this was taken in either the late 1950s or early 1960s, and she was a survivor of Auschwitz. And I think we've got a wonderful blog about this, which I think we can share with you via email afterwards. It's an amazing story, and we have her eyewitness account. But I wanted to quote from her because I think it shows how the gathering of material, the sharing of material, leads to unexpected and extraordinary revelations that can really change people's lives or are profoundly meaningful. So she gave an interview about her survival at Auschwitz and her experience, for example, on a death march, which is incredibly harrowing and powerful. But when she was giving her eyewitness account to the library, in fact, she was asked to give the account when she did her job interview. So she says during her job interview to come work at the library, she says, "I was offered a small sum to write a report on my deportation to Hungary, and actually in terms of the remuneration, it often was a lifeline for survivors who at the time were often struggling to re-establish their lives in Britain." This was in the 1950s. So, in order to write my report, I was given another as an example of what was required. The report was by a cellist from Germany who had been in the Auschwitz extermination camp orchestra. I always had a good memory for faces, and in fact, I had visited the Walfisches a few days earlier. And although I seemed to remember Anita's face, I thought it must be impossible. I can't know her. But then, when I read her eyewitness report, I realized she was the cellist I had spoken to on the day just before I left Auschwitz. So again, these tiny fragments of information that could otherwise be lost, profoundly meaningful, gathered by the library. It just means so much. So this is a photograph of Trude when she was in her 90s, and a really extraordinary woman. I will circulate a link of a blog about her, because you may be interested to learn more. This is another supporter of the library who also survived deportation from Hungary as a child, and just such a sweet photo. I thought I'd mention it because Agnes is one of the library's guardians, and we have a programme of patrons and guardians who have really provided us with a sort of a more security for our future because of being so generous with their giving. And in fact, although Agnes in her lifetime has given documents and she has made a provision for us in her will, which is incredibly generous of her, which is partly why, this is why we've listed her and honoured her as a guardian of the library. But there's just such a sweet photo of her as a child, and she remains incredibly active telling her story today and is a huge champion of the library's work. And then some of you may know Agnes Grunwald-Speer, but I thought I'd mention her because, again, she's a supporter of the library, but she's also a very active user. And she, in a sense, represents that sort of generational shift because she was born in the Budapest ghetto, but was very much a child survivor. And it's a reminder that, sadly, that generation of survivors there are fewer and fewer able to tell their stories. But Agnes is writing yet another book about her experiences, and actually that's another way in which second generation, third generation are doing fantastic work using our resources to put together family stories and publish books. So it's not only about documents and papers, it's also about telling the stories. And I was just speaking to one of the Generation to Generation speakers. So, you know, there are multiple ways that people can continue this mission of the library to ensure the history of the Holocaust, the truth about the Holocaust, is told today and in the future. So I want to say there are many, many ways for you to develop your relationship with the library, for you to support our work. We'd be hugely grateful for your ongoing support, and I'm just so delighted to see so many of you here today. So welcome and thank you. And I just think we should give everybody a round of applause for being part of this. Okay, so we couldn't have put on today's event without amazing contributions from many of our staff team. So I want to say thank you to Howard, who's going to speak to us in just a moment, but also to Stephanie Rauch, our Head of Collections, Carly, Head of Development, Livy, the Library's Administrator, Caroline, our Development Coordinator, Catherine and Samina. The team here has really put in a huge amount of work today to put this event on, so I do want to say thank you to them as well. Okay, and it's my pleasure now to hand over to our senior archivist, Howard Folkson, who I'm sure lots of you know.
Thanks, Toby. Thanks to all of you. It's overwhelming response we got. It was very difficult, actually, to gauge how many people to invite. Potentially, there could have been hundreds, if not more than 1,000 easily. In the 25 years that I've worked here, I've probably met at least 1,500 donors and potential donors. We average probably around 50 to 60 new collections every year, so that's literally one a week. So you can just do the maths. So it is really incredible. One of the common refrains that I quite often hear is, "Oh, you couldn't possibly be interested in my papers. You must have heard this story so many times." But of course, there's lots of themes which are similar, because naturally our collecting remit entails that we're interested in a certain type of material, but obviously every single collection is absolutely unique. And that's what makes it makes them so special. And for me, the greatest part of my job is actually meeting you guys and listening to your stories. And quite often I record those stories, so I can always refer back to them when I'm cataloguing the collections. In fact, even yesterday, just yesterday, I took in my 4th collection this year. And it was a lovely woman, and her cousin came. They had a collection of material from Moravia pertaining to a family that had a brewery, and obviously they couldn't own it anymore, and their business was aeronising it, etc. But she said they'd done so much research on their family that, amongst others, they were related to Fred Astaire and Napoleon Bonaparte. So I said, did you inherit the genes of Fred Astaire? And if so, can you give us a show of your tap dancing skills? And she said, no. But every morning when I wake up, I have this compulsive urge to invade Europe. But that was just yesterday. So who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? As I say, the collections are so diverse, and we tend to get, typically we'll get official documentation, but the really interesting material tends to be the correspondence and the diaries, because in those we really get to learn the personalities of the individuals involved. And it's like, as you read the original material, unmediated by anyone's interpretation, it just transports you back to that time. And of course, many of our collections contain material that's in a language that can't be understood, either because it's a language that's not known, or it's this handwriting is too difficult. And we do employ a number of volunteers and assistants who can assist in that. We can't promise to translate verbatim every collection that's given to us. I've never done that, and hopefully you'll appreciate that. But there have been times, and I know there's a few people here today who've actually benefited from that service that we provided, and that really does unlock those collections, because you've been lovingly looking after those collections for generations, but never been able to access the content. And then finally, we're able to provide that additional support and access. In a way, that's what makes the library unique, because I've worked in other archives before now, and the process of acquiring material was just a simple business transaction. Whereas with most of you guys, I will meet you once, I'll meet you again. You may offer me a cruise to your archive. We may digitise material for you, and we may even translate material for you. So it's a reciprocal relationship, and I've always really appreciated that. So without blathering on too much, I'm going to hand over to our guest speaker today, who's Romeo Vecht. When I first heard Romeo's story, I was really transfixed by it, and I'm sure you will be as well. He's very kindly agreed to give us his own family story, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy that. So I'm going to hand over to Romeo now. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute honor to be here. I've heard about the Wiener Library since I was born, I think, because we're about the same age.
Sorry, I'm just going to adjust this a little bit.
This, as you know, you all know it's a famous edifice. It's the library of the Holocaust. And I must tell you, I'm very proud to be here to tell you my story, which is a bit unusual when it comes to the Holocaust. Now, it all started when my late father passed away, about 50 years ago now. I was left with a suitcase of papers in disarray, and I was too busy in my practice to study the stuff, but I did when I retired, and this is what I'm going to talk to you about. About a year ago, I think, I met Howard and showed him what I had, and he was quite taken by it and decided to house it, so that all this is within this place. Now, my presentation consists of two different parts, but they do fuse into one at the end. So I have to tell you that we are of Dutch ancestry, and the name Vecht is the name of a river in Holland, which the brother of Napoleon decided in about 1810, I think, that all Jews should be given a proper name or take a proper name. And so they must have been living around the Vecht River. And that's one thing. Romeo is a bit peculiar. I know, I get lots of laughter about it, especially when I graduated. How it came about was my Hebrew name is Abraham. Now, I was born in 1935, and we lived in Antwerp in Belgium. And my father went straight to the British Embassy because there were rumors about Mr. Hitler in the background, and Abraham wasn't quite suitable, if you know what I mean. And so they chose the name Romy. There are Romys in our family. A lady at the embassy said, "I'm terribly sorry, sir, but we don't know, we don't recognize that name. You'll have to think of something else." And on the spot, Romeo came up, and that's the way it is to this day. Now, I have to tell you something about the Dutch history, because it's unusual. After the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, Holland became a very free, liberty country where Jews were allowed in, and where they were allowed to practice their religion. It was a country, I must tell you, there were Jews in just about every village. It's quite amazing. And the Dutch were good, and they allowed them to live their lives. They were integrated into society. And I will remind you that there was never a pogrom in Holland. They didn't have to live in ghettos, and there were no expulsions, like most other countries in Europe. Until the Second World War, when the virus of anti-Semitism brought disaster to the Jewish people in Holland. The figures are, I think, roughly, there were 100,000 Jews living in Holland. By the end of the war, 75 out of 100,000 were dead in Auschwitz and in Sobibor. I did my research and I found that something like 70 Vechts perished in these two concentration camps. And the most dramatic one I remember, because I went to Auschwitz in my younger days when the Russians were still there, but I was invited. It's a long story. And I went to what were archives. I wasn't allowed in, but somehow we waited for the right moment. Josh, my son, was about 17, and we went to see these where all the names were kept by the Germans with their great order of things. And there was one name which I will never forget. It said Vaartje Vecht. Vaartje is a Dutch sort of funny name. And Fanny Vecht Arrow Mengele, age 16. Well, of course, she wasn't seen again. And then anti-Semitism, which killed off so many people in Holland, and the Dutch turned against the Jews after all these centuries. And the late Jonathan Sachs called it a virus, the virus of anti-Semitism. And I can tell you, as a medical professional, that virus is absolutely appropriate. Because a lot of people don't know this, but I will tell you. Once you're infected with a virus, it never actually leaves you, unless you die. But if you survive, nests of live, dormant viruses can be found just about everywhere. We found them in hearts, and more recently there was a big study, and herpes zoster, that's a shingle virus, and chickenpox virus were found in the brains of people who'd had the infection years before. So it's a well-chosen definition, and you know what it led to. Now, I think I want to get on with my slides. So what do I press exactly?
Okay, so
That one? No. Oh, yes. So, okay, so I've told you what I'm going to talk about, and this is the beginning of the Dutch family. This is the Vandenbergs, and these are my great-grandparents, and the lady is a Vandenberg lady. And this is my grandfather. He was a half Vandenberg, and he is here in Australia. But I have to tell you that before going to Australia, he lived about 20 years in London, because the Vandenbergs invented margarine. And he was sent over to start it in England, but the farmers here wouldn't have it. So as far as I know, there was no margarine until World War I. But it didn't work. And so he decided to change, and he went into the meat industry. Not quite the same, but he made a living out of that. But for the 20 years that he lived here, he was very attracted to Zionism. And I've seen papers of him chairing right, left and center, and that's the way he was. And there they went to Australia, I think in early 1890s, and that's a picture. You can see my grandfather in the middle wearing a kippah because he was very orthodox, and the little baby in the middle there, if this works, should work. That baby there is my late father, aged about 2 or 3. They had 9 children, and he had polio as a child. Polio, there was no treatment then, and he was weak for the rest of his life on the right side of his body. This becomes important as I go on. And going back to the margarine, this was the first factory. You know, it's quite a business. This is about 1840 in Holland. Oh, stuck. Oh, I see what you mean. How do I go back? Home?
Will you go back on it?
Home.
This one.
Right.
Yeah.
These are pictures of the first factory, and you know it's quite amazing what was going on. Cans. Look at the staff. Carcasses. Sheep. And this one is rather interesting because there's a guy there with a kippah. And this is meat going over to England. Now, you know, in those days, it meant 6 weeks. Now, how do you keep meat 6 weeks? Well, he invented some sort of refrigeration. And this is probably kosher stuff with a shoma there. And he then posed a question, it's known as a shaila, to the rabbis of his time. When should the meat be koshered? At the time of slaughter, or when it's been refrigerated on arrival in England? Big question in those days, and I think the decision was at the time of slaughter. Right. Have I jumped anything? No. Anyhow, you can see that the Vecht business was sold to Univer in the 1930s. So if you look at all the packages of Univer, you will see Vandenberg written down somewhere. I didn't inherit anything, unfortunately, but that's another story. Right, and then he lived in Sydney, and he started the beginning of Zionism in Australia. And there's a book somewhere, it doesn't appear here, from a professor of Jewish history in Melbourne, where she mentions an English Jew who used to be in the Chovevei Zion in London and who started the beginning of Zionism in Australia. After 4 or 5 years, they left Australia and they went to South Africa, again on meat business. And you can see him here, bang in the middle, with his hat and beard, and South African staff. And the story is that he dealt with the De Beers, and he met Cecil Rhodes, both being involved in the business of meat. And then finally, in the New York Times, dated 1907, the margarine king was dead. That was Simon Vandenberg, the son of the previous chap I showed you. Right. Now, grandfather was an early Zionist, and this is the first page of what is known as the Golden Book of the Keren Kayemet, which is now the Jewish National Fund. And this organization was put in place to raise money for the oncoming Palestine. And if you can't probably see it, well, I keep doing this. Anyhow, he was number 6 on that slide. I need some help. I want to go back to this. Previous slide. No, it doesn't work. Okay. This one?
It's the laptop version.
Yeah. I want you to look at this because it's of historical importance. I don't know if you can see, but these are the early Zionists. I think that one is, I can't read from here. One of them is Theodor Herzl. and there's a lot of others. Grandfather, they all donated about £10 in 1901, which was probably a lot of money then. And he was the sixth Zionist, in that list. And then he went on. He was part of the editing board of the Jewish Standard. Some Zionists found that the Jewish Chronicle wasn't quite religious enough, which is probably the situation today, as far as I know. There's lots of Haredi papers, magazines coming out. So the Jewish Standard, it only lasted about 4 years. This particular sample is interesting because it says in there somewhere that Hannah Rothschild died. And there's an obituary about her. Now, if you don't know who Hannah Rothschild was, I will tell you in a nutshell. She was married to Lord Rosebery. She was the richest woman in this country, richer than Queen Victoria. And she was religious. And she remained an Orthodox Jewess right to her death when she was about 39, 40. And there's a lot of flats around where we live, in Maida Vale area, where you could still see that she built these things for poor Jewish people. Lord Rosebery became Prime Minister in the last few years of Queen Victoria. He missed her terribly. By the way, she's buried in the Willesden Jewish Cemetery. And he had a problem with that because, he was a Christian. But the story goes that when she produced her first baby, a son, he was a gambler, this man. He looked at the son, and you know the famous gambling words, les jeux sont faits, rien ne va plus. He said, le juif est fait, rien ne va plus. That's Lord Rosebery's story. Okay. And the other thing about the newspaper, Israel Zangwill befriended my grandfather, and he, forget this for a minute, Israel Zangwill did take part in this Jewish Standard and wrote an editorial every week under his nom de plume, which was Maror and Karoset, which from the Pesach Seder. Maror being sweet, Karoset being bitter, because he was very critical of Jewish society in those days. This is a slide, it's out of place, but this is a slide of the saying that Aaron Vecht was a promoter of Zionism in Australia. Now, we come to the Zionist Congress in Basel. The bottom one is the 5th Congress, and he was representing London, down there somewhere. Delegierte Karte. By the way, the original language of the Zionists was German. English came much later. Everything was in German. He also attended the 7th up there, and he was then representing Australia and New Zealand. By the 8th Congress, he was ill. He came to London and he died soon after. And so a number of these people who attended the 8th Congress sent him postcards. You can see where he lived in Kilburn. And I will just point out some of the people who signed in. One of them is Chaim Weizmann. Then you've got Moses Gaster, who was then the Chacham of the Sephardic community, and so on and so on. I mean, so many of them you can't even read these days, or at least you don't know who they are. And on the reverse, you've got the famous Rebbe Reiners, very famous man in his time. This is Sholem Aleichem. And somewhere here is the chief rabbi of the empire in those days, Rabbi Hertz. And then, like all good things that come to the end, the year before he died, he spent in Argentina. This was maybe 2 years before he died. And why Argentina? Again, about meat. And he discovered that a lot of Jews were working in agriculture, people who'd left Russia and Poland after the 1800 pogroms. And he was very disappointed because they were too poor to buy kosher food. And then, as you can see, there's another picture there, taken in Buenos Aires, and the little fellow there in the middle is my grandfather, my grandfather, and the rest of the family in Buenos Aires. He came back, died in Antwerp, and again the Jewish Chronicle produced this obituary. So he was a well-recognized gentleman, my grandfather. Okay. There's his tomb. Im Eshkechacha Yerushalayim Tishach Yemenu, which is a very famous psalm, which says, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, my right hand will lose its skills. Now we come to World War II, and it was a Friday morning on the 10th of May. I remember, because I was 4 years old, that the night before, Antwerp was being bombed by the Germans. And I was in my bed thinking about all these bombers up there, and I thought to myself, God, this man Hitler is up there somewhere. So we knew about Hitler. We fled on that 10th of May, on the Friday. We drove on Shabbat all the way into France, aiming at Dunkirk, because we knew the British Expeditionary Force were holding on, and they did for a while. Unfortunately, driving with us was my mother's father. Now, he came from Krakow when Krakow was Austrian. So he had an Austrian passport, and the French would not let him in. So I think my father wasted two weeks. Eventually we got through, arrived in Dunkirk, and were greeted by German paratroopers. The British had left and were taken prisoner along with my father. My father was a civilian, but nevertheless he was taken to Brussels, disappeared for 3 months. And my mother had 3 months to go look for him, and she did find him. And he was in the Centenaire, which is a big place in Brussels, with probably thousands of British prisoners of war. And he was made the official translator between the Brits and the Germans, because he could speak both. And eventually he was freed. And the first slide is addressed to my mother on the 21st of July 1940, so 2 or 3 months after Dunkirk and all that, giving us permission, giving her and the children permission to go back to our flat. This had been sealed off. The caretaker had made sure that all the silver had gone, etc., etc. But we were allowed to go back. And then, so this is 1940. The Germans were very clever, and they allowed the Jews in Antwerp to lead a normal life, noting exactly who they were, and where the diamonds were. And then in June 41, Jewish restrictions came in. So they had a long time to decide what needed to be done. Now, this is a letter which literally saved our lives. It's by a GP, Flemish GP, who consulted my father on the 21st of January. So this is just before the Jewish restrictions are coming in. And he made up a story that my father was paralyzed on the right side, which was not true. He was weak, but not paralyzed. And that my father needed a cure. A cure. And the cure would be in Spa. Spa in the Ardennes is the spa of all spas. It was very famous, it still is. And the Tsar of Russia based there, and so did my hero, Benjamin Disraeli, with his wife. And that's the story of that letter, okay? And so we had to apply to go to Spa, and these are real German documents, all Feldkommandatur, blah, 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 allowing the Vechts to go to Spa for a cure. And so we went to Spa. And then came out the Jewish restrictions, and these letters, all again with Hakenkreuz and all the rest of it, these letters allowing us to stay in Spa, but in forced residence, not allowed to move, not allowed to travel, not allowed to earn money, not allowed to do anything, under supervision by the Gestapo. So my father underwent his cure. The Germans, as you know, are very correct people in certain respects. So that is Bescheinigung. It's a receipt, because they came to our flat. I think my parents were fairly wealthy in those days. And there was a radio which they took away because it was faulty. And of course it was going to, after the war, we were going to get it back. Oh, I'm still waiting. And then comes November 43. So the years have gone by. Germany is losing. They lost in Stalingrad. They lost in El Alamein. And these blinking Jewish people are still around in Spa having a cure after 2 or 3 years. And the Germans were starting to worry about this. And you see how meticulous they are, because they named my father, my mother, my sister, myself. And what are these blinking Jews doing still there? So that was in November 43. And this is, the Belgians have to repeat what the Germans do. You know, this was throughout Europe. The Belgians had nothing to say, neither did the French or anybody else. So this is just a permission from the Belgian authorities for us to stay in Spa. And I can't remember what this is now. I think it's the same thing. Now, if you remember, D-Day was in June 44. Now, on the night of the night previous to the 1st of July, there was a hell of a row between my parents. We had to live in a small bungalow, and I'd never heard my parents row. Now, the reason was these letters. These letters came in, as I say, on the 1st of July, offering us to be exchanged with German prisoners in mid-channel, allowing us to travel to Ostend, first to Brussels. In Brussels, they tell you exactly where to go, and then to Ostend to get on a ship for an exchange. And my mother, who was of Polish descent, did not trust the Germans, and my father, who was very British, I'll tell you why in a minute, he said, yes, we want to go, but we didn't. And we learned after the war that indeed there had been a transfer of prisoners. Why us? I mean, we weren't diplomats, we weren't anything important, we weren't military, I'll never know. But that's what happened. Okay. Now, comes the 10th of September 44, and the Americans turned up. This was the first US Army. They landed in Normandy and found all their way into Spa. And I jumped on the first jeep I ever saw, and they quickly dressed me up, as you can see. If you don't recognize me, that's me. That's my mother, my sister, and the Belgian girl who used to help us. And she was allowed, by the way, to accompany us to Ostend on the exchange, which never happened. Now, the thing about these GIs, a lot of them were Jewish. And when they heard that there was a Jewish family still free, because there had been a lot of Jews hidden in Spa during the war, most of them were caught up, and we could see them, you know, when they were in the famous little van off to Auschwitz. We had a governess, and she disappeared, and so on and so on. And until this, well, the GIs, first of all, they came, I remember the first Rosh Hashanah. By then I was about 9. There were about 30 GIs in the room. That's the first time I heard a shofar, and we heard kosher food and all the rest of it. The rabbi of the unit was called Maurice Franks, and he called me in one day. He said, "Romeo, I'm going to give you a present for your bar mitzvah." And he gave me some tefillin, phylacteries. And I must tell you that I still wear them. It's about 80 years now. Now, unknown to us, my father was approached by the Belgian resistance. Why? Because there was an organization throughout Europe trying to return downed pilots to England. You know, a plane is a plane, but a pilot needs training. And so all over, in hidden places in the forest, little Lysander planes came down and picked up these pilots and flew them back to London. And quite a lot survived. 55,000 died. And my father was then approached because all the messages in codes were from London, in English. And nobody in that part of the world understood a word of English. And so I didn't know this, of course, until after the war. But when I asked my father, "Why did you do this?" He did it for 2.5 years. He said, "Well, we didn't know what was going to happen the next day. Why not?" And he got lots. This is a Belgian attestation that he was in the resistance. He got lots of medals. And this is my prime piece of World War II. It's Order of the Day, thanking the Belgian resistance for helping the Allies, etc., etc. And it's addressed to my father, and it's signed by Dwight Eisenhower. And the date of this is October, and we enjoyed freedom. For the first time, you could go freely everywhere. You know, under the German occupation in the park or in the cinema, it said Juden nicht erlaubt, which means Jews not allowed, not permitted. I think that's the end of this one. And we were free. And amongst all these GIs, I remember one of them. His name was Alexander. He was a chef in that regiment, and he introduced us to powdered eggs. There were no eggs during the war, of course not. And I remember him making an omelette, adding water to the egg and then stirring it with his finger. You know, that's the army. He came in one day a few months after this, in that terrible winter of December 44. And as you may remember, there were 250,000 German soldiers who reappeared, hidden, broke through the American lines, aiming at Antwerp, taking the Americans totally by surprise, and killing off something like 40,000 Americans, until the skies lifted and the RAF and the Air Force got rid of the Germans. But they almost made it. Now, here are a few pictures of GIs. This is our little bungalow. My parents, myself, my sister, and 2 Jewish boys. And this was a surgeon, a captain in the US Army, Jewish captain. And he told me, I was a kid, I was 9, he told me that, I knew I was going to be a doctor, by the way. I knew this a long time before. And he told me in great secrecy that he was treating a bloodied, wounded SS. And he told the SS, you need a blood transfusion. And the SS said, Heil Hitler, I don't want any Jewish blood. And he died on the spot. And this is Captain Zunz, a direct descendant of the famous Leopold Zunz. He was in the intelligence, and he used to invite me to his office, and, you know, it was fascinating stuff. This is rather tragic. The boy with the helmet is called Herbert Freudmann. He's about 17 here. He was hidden in Spa, and I remember going to his bar mitzvah. It was clandestine, and I remembered a few years before this picture. At the age of 17, he joined the US Army and never was seen or heard of again. Now, at this stage, I want to thank, first of all, Howard for looking after us and taking all my files for safety. I want to thank the rabbi for all his work with the slides, all the intricacies of modern technology. So there'll be a video of this talk. Thank you, Rabbi. I salute you. And of course, my second son, Joshua, who is a genius at PowerPoints, i.e. these things, and he even mentioned the translations, and he's just a great son to have. Now, the last picture is of my parents. I miss it now. And it just shows you right at the end. Gosh, you're good, you are. Further, further.
I can't quite get there.
Next one.
I think it's the next one.
Yeah.
There. So these are my parents. I will never know and never understand how they survived, because they protected us. They protected us to the point that I remember clearly being taken to a monastery with my sister in case they were taken and we should be saved. And I remember the priest sort of caressing me. You know, it's a big thing to baptize a Jewish child. And many were and never came back. So my parents survived in anguish under barbaric German occupation. And here they are, a few years after the war, having a good weekend in Paris and enjoying life all over again. Thank you.
Thank you, Romeo. What an extraordinary story. I don't know if anyone has any. Romeo, I don't know if you would be happy to answer any questions. I don't know if anyone has any burning questions you'd like
Any
to ask.
questions? Yes.
But if not, then I think what we'll do is all gather together, take advantage of the coffee and cake that we have at the back. Also, it'd be great for everyone to mingle and get to know other people that have donated. wonderful documents and photographs like these to the library. But yes, let's thank Romeo one more time and everyone.